Today, a story about your company can originate on a niche blog at breakfast, trend on social media by lunch, and cement itself into a permanent narrative on a global scale before you even clock out. But despite this breakneck speed, the communications teams tasked with protecting corporate reputations are largely fighting these battles with tools designed for a completely different era. This visual illustrates the core flaw of legacy dashboards. They are built to tally how many times your name appears. They're very good at counting these isolated dots, but entirely blind to how those mentions connect to form a cohesive narrative web. To understand why we operate blind in an environment flooded with data, we need to trace the 150-year evolution of media tracking and locate exactly where the system broke down. When stories move in hours rather than months, the speed at which you collect data matters less than the speed at which you can see the story it is trying to tell. The industry's original sin, the obsession with volume, was born out of physical necessity in the 1880s. When Henry Romeike launched one of the first organized press clipping agencies, his clerks used physical scissors to slice out articles referencing a client's name. The process took days or weeks, and the final deliverable answered exactly one question: how many times did your name appear in print? By the mid-20th century, radio and television arrived. Now, instead of just reading, agencies needed rooms full of operators wearing headphones, manually translating broadcasts onto chalkboards. The labor required skyrocketed, but the analytical depth stayed exactly the same. As media formats multiplied, the math broke down. The raw volume of mentions began to physically outpace the human capacity to read, sort, and understand them. For 100 years, media monitoring faced one bottleneck: human analysts struggling to keep their heads above a rising tide of physical media. Then came the internet. In the 1990s, digital databases replaced physical archives, and desktop computers replaced the clipping clerks. The dominant tool of this era was Boolean search. PR teams could finally filter the entire web simply by stringing together keywords with logic operators like and or. Boolean logic is completely blind to context. A passing reference buried in paragraph 14 of an obscure blog triggers the exact same alert as a massive headline in the Wall Street Journal. The system treats them exactly the same. By the 2010s, social media exploded. Post volumes reached the billions, meaning a crisis could spread in minutes. The industry tried rudimentary sentiment analysis, slapping positive or negative tags onto millions of posts. But early classifiers missed sarcasm and entirely failed to evaluate context. Digital tools didn't solve the problem, they just accelerated data collection. Teams stared at chaotic dashboards, drowning in noise, while spending entire quarters trying to manually compile reports. Modern machine learning and natural language processing changed the goalposts. Instead of just identifying keywords, these systems can now parse the actual intent and relationship between words. Consider two phrases: earnings beat expectations and narrowly avoided a miss. They share keywords, but AI recognizes they convey opposite signals. AI also applies brand prominence and source authority weighting to prioritize high readership publications. But the most significant leap is automatically grouping thousands of isolated mentions into cohesive thematic narrative clusters. By mapping these clusters in real time, communications leaders can see exactly which storylines are gaining momentum, allowing them to amplify a helpful narrative or address a risk before it hardens into public consensus. For a century and a half, the target was the human audience. Today, a primary consumer of your brand's media coverage is artificial intelligence itself. Large language models like ChatGPT now process billions of queries from users who are using AI assistants to discover, research, and evaluate companies. These models do not have independent thoughts. When someone asks an AI about your brand, it generates an answer by synthesizing the very narrative clusters and earned media ecosystems that traditional tools only passively tracked. If a brand ignores its narrative layer, external forces define the inputs, and the brand loses all control over how machine intelligence introduces them to the world. This shifts the entire role of communications. It is no longer about simply counting mentions. It is about reputation engineering, actively managing the narrative inputs that define your brand for both human perception and the AI systems that synthesize our world.